To those joining the webinar this afternoon, the topic, as has been broadcast, is Beyond ASEAN's 5-point consensus, humanitarian assistance to Myanmar. We thank the organizers, Progressive Voice, Forum Asia, and Civicus for bringing us all together here. Let me just start with just a few housekeeping information, if I may. The duration of the webinar will more or less be 1.5 hours from now. And as was indicated earlier, there will be Burmese interpretation available. The event will consist of a panel discussion with 4 esteemed experts on the subject from Myanmar and ASEAN. And at the end of the presentations, there will, of course, be a Q&A session that can be submitted through the Q&A box normally at the bottom of the screen on the Zoom. I'm honored to be invited to chair this, moderate this webinar. My task would be just to perhaps direct the traffic, and but if there's a bit of a jam, then I might have to redirect and reroute and free up the flow. Further to that, let me just point a few issues as baseline for the discussions. The webinar is being held in lieu of or in aligning with the consultative meeting on humanitarian aid assistance hosted by the ASEAN Chair, Cambodia, which will be taking place on Friday to announce plans for humanitarian assistance to be delivered to Myanmar by ASEAN. It would seem that the plan has been developed by Cambodia solely in consultation with the junta. Now, it is more than 1 year since the 5-point consensus was first agreed by ASEAN, which included a point for the provision of humanitarian assistance to Myanmar by the AHA Center. The meeting, the consultative meeting, of course, will also take place a week or more so ahead of the important US-ASEAN summit, which has been planned for some time now. And it would seem that there are long-standing and well-founded concerns that the junta will seek to instrumentalize humanitarian assistance, and that ASEAN's partnering solely with the junta on the issue will have political and security ramifications for the Myanmar people and the democratic movement. Many of the people in urgent need of humanitarian assistance are in areas outside of the junta's control. Let me just also emphasize that there is a conflict going on in Myanmar. Perhaps more so than a conflict, it may be qualified as a war that is taking place. The ASEAN has come out with some very disturbing statistics. Between February 1 of last year and the 15th of April 2022, the number of armed clashes in Myanmar exceeds that of Syria, Yemen, Iraq, or Afghanistan in the same period. Those who have been killed, one number 2,000 plus, detained 13,000 plus, including MPs, journalists, humanitarian workers, civil society actors, and students. It would seem clearly that the junta is the root of violence. In 2022 alone, 3,000 plus clashes, armed clashes, airstrikes, shelling, etc., have taken place in Myanmar. With that background, ASEAN has now come to the point where the point 4 of the 5-point consensus is being proposed to be implemented, and a consultative meeting is going to be held on Friday. Now, humanitarian assistance basically is a standalone effort. It has to be impartial, it has to be independent, and therefore there is this question: how far can ASEAN be able to do that if the humanitarian assistance is being implemented as part of a political settlement? 4 speakers will address this issue, and if I may just mention the order of presentation, it would seem that perhaps it's best that our discussion start from the situation on the ground up, and therefore our first speaker will be Mr. Salai Zaukling, who is the executive director of the Chin Human Rights Organization. The second speaker will be Ms. Ngao Tutu, who is the program director of the Karen Human Rights Group. The third speaker will be Ms. Adelina Kama, former director, executive director of the AHA Center. And last but not least, former foreign minister from Thailand, Kun Kasit Piromia. Without further ado, could I now invite our first speaker, Mr. Salai Zaukling, to kick off the discussion. You have 8 to 10 minutes, as indicated by Vin earlier. And perhaps you might want to touch on the humanitarian crisis in Chin State and how local networks of community-based and civil society organizations are responding to it. Please, you have the floor.
The mic is mute. The mic is mute.
So sorry. Thank you very much for the organizers for putting this together in such a short period of time. Forum Asia, Civicus, and Progressive Voice. I'll be mainly speaking about the situation in Chin State and also a little bit about the Northwest region in general. And then I'll go on to talk about a little bit about the 5-point ASEAN consensus, as well as the issue of humanitarian aid in the country. Just as a reminder about the Chin context, if you look at the Burma map, Chin only constitute by population 1% of the population. However, over the last 1 year after the military coup, we've seen Chin being targeted and have suffered disproportionately at the hands of the SAC military regime. We now have 20% roughly of the population of Chin State having been displaced within a span of 1 year, which is a very significant number if you look at the overall number of the Chin living within Chin State. And Chin State borders with Magwe and Sagaing region in the northwest, where some of the fightings have been intensified over the last many months now. We've seen destruction of whole villages, people fleeing for their lives every day. This shows the number of people that have been displaced from the region. And according to the UN, of the 900,000 estimated internally displaced people in Burma, over 340,000 come from this region, the three regions, the Northwest region in Burma. And if you look at the number of the displaced population in Chin State, just within this region, it's also 20% of the people who have been internally displaced. And these are figures from the UN. And if you look at the comparison between what we as an organization have gathered over the last year, it's significantly higher. So there's reason to believe that the number is actually much higher than the UN figures. And also what happened within the last few weeks in the region, the displacement is expected to be much, much higher. If you look at the entire population that has been displaced, again, the UN figure, since the coup, out of 500,000, again, Chin displacement is staggering. It's 12% of those displaced after the coup within a year. So that translates to 1 in every 5 person Chin having been displaced since February 1, 2021. And that also translates to 1 in every 10 person being internally displaced within the country. We have up to 50,000 refugees who have crossed into India in the state of Mizoram over the past 1 year. And again, 67,000 people are believed to be internally displaced as we speak. And because of the ongoing military assault in the western part of the country, including Chin State, humanitarian aid access has been cut off. All supply routes leading to Chin State are being blockaded by the junta troops. And Chin State has not been receiving normal goods and supplies for the past many months now. So the junta is actively blocking humanitarian aid at the same time that we're talking about humanitarian aid, the possibility of humanitarian aid being delivered by the junta itself. So what is causing all this crisis? If you look at Chin State and who is responsible, now we have fightings going all over across the state, and not to speak of what's happening in Sagaing and Magway regions, where fightings have been intensified in the last month. And again, of over 13,000 people who've been arbitrarily arrested and detained, 7% or nearly 1,000 people come from Chin State. And again, when it comes to unlawful killing, the documented number nationally, if you compare to the number in Chin State, it stands at 11%. And this conflict has also particular impact on children. The number of fatalities as of last month stand at 14, of which some of the killings have been too brutal to be even describing here. For example, this 13-year-old boy was stabbed and his throat slashed by the soldiers while he was just visiting near his village. And the brutality has not confined to within the ordinary civilians. Women also particularly suffer the impact of the coup. We have recorded 12 fatalities, a number of 18 injuries, and over 100, nearly 200 people, women, having been arrested between February 2001 and 2002. And again, if you look at the number of destruction of civilian livelihood, properties, houses burned in Chin State constitute 17% of the number nationally. So Chin State has disproportionately suffered various kinds of human rights violations, leading to the displacement situation that we are talking about today. In all categories of violations, including religious freedom, where at least 50 religious buildings have been destroyed in Chin State over the last year. 35 of them are places of worship, and 15 of them are religious buildings attached to Christian churches. I'll end my PowerPoint here, but I'd like to touch on a little bit about what the ASEAN 5-point consensus means for humanitarian aid in the country. If we can remind ourselves of what are the points of the 5-point consensus. First is an end to violence, followed by dialogue between the parties, and dialogue facilitated by ASEAN Special Envoy. The fourth being the provision of humanitarian assistance. And lastly, a visit by ASEAN delegates to Myanmar to meet with all concerned parties. And if you look at what has happened over the last year since the consensus was reached, none of the point has made any headway. In fact, we can say that the consensus has clearly failed. And now ASEAN is scrambling to organize a consultation meeting tomorrow on the distribution of humanitarian aid through its AHA Center. And this is largely to project some appearance of some progress being made within the points in the consensus. And the fact that AHA centers will be involved in the aid coordination and delivery by ASEAN own standard, that would require the junta's approval and oversight. This would clearly give the junta the propaganda tool it desperately needs, but also the legitimacy it craves. And the junta is looking to buy time with deception and by using the ASEAN consensus. And the junta itself has not shown any good faith or intent to show respect or any interest in implementing the consensus. And that was clearly demonstrated by the fact that while ASEAN was trying to scramble the consultation meeting, it handed down a 5-year jail sentence to Daw Aung San Suu Kyi. And it was clearly a slap on the face of ASEAN. And ASEAN is now clearly pretending that this will work. The question arises about who needs humanitarian aid the most in Myanmar today.
Salai, could you wrap up in 1 minute, please?
Yes, thank you. And this is the displaced population largely, and those fleeing attacks, ongoing attacks from the junta troops. And the junta is now involved in the possibly the delivery of humanitarian aid in the country. So if you, I just wanted to end this presentation by with this thought that every day that a response is delayed and ASEAN 5 points is prolonged is another day of bloodshed and devastation for the millions of defenseless citizens. So thank you for giving me this opportunity, and I'd be happy to engage in the Q&A afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it was a very useful presentation. Thank you for reminding us of the 5-point consensus. I had wanted just to stay away from the 5-point consensus because I wanted to focus on the humanitarian dimension. But nevertheless, it was useful to have that in mind. Now, you have also been giving us the scale of the issues. According to the UN, of course, as you mentioned, 14 million plus have been displaced in Myanmar as a whole. And might I remind you that this is 3 times of those displaced in Ukraine, which is 5 million plus. Although they've been all over Europe, but in this case in Myanmar, it has been internally within the country, but also spilling over into India. Now, the takeaways, of course, is that from a practical point of view, it would seem that it would be illogical to send humanitarian assistance to the junta when the junta is the cause of the crisis, and that people in need are more in the areas where the junta does not have control along the borders. And therefore, as Salai was reminding us, the junta's attacks are happening on a daily basis, and therefore any delay would just prolong the suffering of the people. Thank you, Salai. And we will now turn to our second panelist, Ms. Nau Tutu. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mazuki. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Notutu, the program director at Current Human Rights Group. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today about the humanitarian crisis in current state, Southeast Burma. Since the coup, current state has once again become a key target of attack by the Myanmar military, not just through air and ground offensive, killing and arbitrary arrest, but also through the blockade of humanitarian aid. I heard from the background noise. I don't know where it is from. Sorry. Over 117,000 people in current states have been displaced since the beginning of the coup. Some villagers have been displaced for over a year now. It is clear, however, that only a small fraction of IDPs are receiving any form of formal assistance. Most are struggling to have access to food, basic living supply, and medical care. The Thai government has placed heavy constraints on former border crossings into Thailand and has pushed back those seeking refuge, despite Thai government claims its commitment to assisting people from Burma fleeing unrest. It has also been difficult to establish formal or officially recognized displacement sites on either side of Thai-Burma border. Therefore, most displacements remain internal and informal, with IDP hiding wherever they can in the jungle in the cave. The SEC cannot trust to have any involvement in the provisions of humanitarian aid to ethnic areas and ethnic populations in Burma. Despite Myanmar's promise to facilitate the distributions of humanitarian assistance to priority areas, the SEC has repeatedly denied life-saving assistance to civilians in need in ethnic areas. The SEC has imposed travel restrictions on humanitarian workers, blocked access roads and aid convoy, destroyed non-military supplies, attacked aid workers, and shut down telecommunication service. This kind of SEC violence against civilians, attack on the humanitarian workers in service, made the junta the root cause of the humanitarian emergency. From early on, KHRG received information that SEC soldiers based near the Salween River were shooting at boats transporting supply to IDPs who fled the airstrike in current state. When boat driver states, "We dare not go to send ration for the IDP. The supplies are accumulating on the Thai side." We continue to receive reports of SEC soldiers deliberately impeding the transportation of food, medical supplies, and other essential items, as well as confiscating and destroying these items at checkpoints. The SEC has also increased its checkpoints near towns and acting as gatekeepers of the movement of any food and supply out of town toward rural ethnic areas. Food insecurity is now a problem of the majority of rural villagers in current state, because the SEC has returned to a focused approach of cutting off essential resources to civilians as a means to destroy the support base of ethnic organizations. All villagers in current state, whether displaced or not, are currently confronting problems in access to food, work, healthcare, education, and other essential services, and thus are in need of support. In these situations, international NGOs are not able to assess the majority of people in need in ethnic areas most heavily impacted by the conflict and SSU operations. Local civil society organization and community-based organization, ethnic service provider, and faith-based organization, all of whom have a knowledge of and experience with the local context, have been the primary actors providing humanitarian aid and emergency support to displaced villagers for decades. These groups are collaborating to formalize several displacement sites along the Thai-Burma border so as to assure the minimal level of service to the IDPs that have fled there. They have also been working to distribute emergency support to IDPs and other vulnerable people further inland. And yet, these groups are excluded from major funding sources, while others continue to be directed towards INGOs and SEC. Any funds or support channel through the SEC cannot be seen as neutral. Many organizations and governments continue to work with the SEC on the ground of neutrality. When the junta is abusing and weaponizing humanitarian assistance, using it as a tool to leverage political legitimacy, the humanitarian claims of impartiality and neutrality become a farce. Any further and support to the SEC only serve to enable SEC to continue waging war against ethnic people. And humanitarian aid workers would either be unable to deliver support or continue to face threats and risk to life in doing so. This humanitarian crisis is a result of a human rights and political crisis in which the clear violator is SEC and the military. Failure to understand the political dynamics in which international aid is embedded will only exacerbate the humanitarian crisis in Burma. Cross-border channels are critical to ensure that people in ethnic areas are able to receive needed aid. Cross-border channels are able to operate more independently and effectively under the current situations. One of the key reasons is that access to those in need does not rest on the approval from the SEC. It is mistake to believe that cross-border aid is only reached a small portions of the populations in need. Cross-border channels also extend beyond the borders areas, reaching vulnerable populations further inland, and thus are the most effective means of delivery aid throughout ethnic areas. It's also important to recognize that the severity of need is concentrated in the border areas, since displaced people are fleeing urban area in the central zones toward border areas. Yes, the SEC chairman of the Task Force on Humanitarian Assistance, Kukulai, has repeatedly stated that outside assistance can only be distributed through assigned channels such as Yangon International Airport, Yangon Seaport, adding that no aid would be allowed to go through border checkpoint with neighboring countries like Thailand or India. This kind of implementation plan is meant to keep humanitarian assistance under the control of SEC and to continue to cover up much needed assistance to the most vulnerable, further excluding ethnic area from aid and limiting the ability of local-based border organizations to engage in protection service. There is not one solution to the current humanitarian crisis, nor should there be only one channel for the provisions of humanitarian aid. The current situation has highlighted how narrow the system of international aid distribution is, since most major funding is directed to the organizations that are currently unable to operate on the ground due to the military restrictions and ongoing violence. And yet, there has been little tangible effort to reroute those funds to the local actors and organizations who are currently operating and providing need support. Greater recognition of local actors as the equal partners and focal points for service delivery process, but instead treats them as equal partners in the creations and implementations of aid programs and services. Independent organizations and consortium, like the border consortiums that can channel funds directly to local service provider and civil CSO already exist and are effective means of ensure that humanitarian aid is provided to most in need.
Could you wrap up in 1 minute, please?
Yes, those models should be further support and extend. So I hope that ASEAN leaders and the international community will listen carefully to the call of local actors operating on the ground. They know the current challenges and they have been working towards solution, but are in desperate need of funding. It is imperative to include them in the decision-making process in order to have effective solution to the current crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Tutu, and thank you for, again, providing this perspective, the timeline perspective that humanitarian assistance, in fact, go back, and the humanitarian crisis go back decades when the conflict pre-coup d'etat took place. In the meantime, in 2021, the COVID pandemic was becoming widespread, and plus the conflict and violence that took place after the ill-fated and ill-conceived coup d'etat by the junta, and therefore we have a perfect emergency situation there in Myanmar, and therefore the message here perhaps is that humanitarian needs have been there for the last 10 plus years, and therefore the challenge now is to scale up the need and the support to be given to the local networks who have been working on this for many years and are the most trusted party by the people, and therefore this has to be taken into account when the humanitarian actions are undertaken, that focusing on the border areas would be primary and imperative. And now, and therefore this will then perhaps be addressed by our next speaker, Ms. Adelina Kamal. You have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Pak Marzuki. Good afternoon, greetings from Jakarta, Indonesia. First of all, thank you to the three co-organizers for providing me the opportunity to speak in this webinar. I have two questions that have been given to me, and I'll try to address the first question first. And this is what we can expect from the consultative meeting on the humanitarian assistance scheduled tomorrow on the 6th of May, organized by Cambodia as the ASEAN chair. So I've been asked this question. What can we expect, Ibu Adelina, from this meeting tomorrow? What would you consider as a good outcome of that consultative meeting? In short, not much. Well, that is probably too diplomatic of me. Honestly speaking, I would say it's going to be a joke. And I'm going to outline 6 signs of backtracking, signs of regress rather than progress. So all of these are unexpected. First, how can we trust the outcome of a consultative meeting when the source of violence is there, making decision on how aid should be directed and managed? Picture this scenario, and I hope it won't happen, and I hope it won't be discussed tomorrow. If the consultative meeting decide on establishing humanitarian corridors inside Myanmar, who will actually determine where these humanitarian corridors be located? If this area is going to be controlled by the Myanmar junta, do we really think that the people of Myanmar who have been terrorized by the junta will go willingly into these areas? First. Second point, there are the so-called humanitarian principles. The previous speakers have talked about it. And one of them is neutrality, as mentioned by Tutu. If you want to be neutral, ladies and gentlemen, not taking side, why is ASEAN only involving one party to the conflict who happens to be the source of violence? Explain it to me. And what have been the steps taken to ensure an inclusive consultative meeting? How inclusiveness in line with the 5-point consensus would be ensured if the consultative meeting fails to be inclusive? Third, what we have seen in the past 1 year and so, based on what we have seen in the past 1 year and so, do you really think that the junta, who has repeatedly blocked aid and attacked humanitarian actors, both international and local, would be willingly, this time around, allowing unimpeded access of aid? If the meeting tomorrow claims that they will make a move, I will be curious of the arrangements and the conditions made for that. Because in situation of conflict, transparency of the intent, ways to access the most affected people, and accountability mechanism for the affected people should be made clear at the outset. Otherwise, trust will be compromised. Fourth, one of the humanitarian principles is also about operational independence, as mentioned by Pak Marzuki. And I wrote about this in one of my articles, that humanitarian actors should be given independence of assessment and operation and flexibility to engage with different parties. But again, let's picture this scenario, and I hope it won't happen. The junta may dictate which local partners that the AHA Center would engage in distributing the aid, and where and how the aid should be distributed. I hope it won't happen. But do you think that that means operational independence? The issue, and I have again written about it in October, that ASEAN has been using disaster management mechanism for conflict setting. It should not be. The disaster management agreement of ASEAN and the AHA Center as the operational agent, they have all been guided by the International Disaster Response Law and the relevant UNGA resolutions related to disaster. And part of the disaster management agreement, the government of the disaster affected country is part of the decision making, as mentioned by Salai. The affected country makes requests and offer of assistance. They also exercise the direction and control of assistance. These are okay for natural disaster when the country is willing to provide assistance and able to provide assistance to the people. But the context for the Myanmar crisis is different. Therefore, assistance using this disaster management mechanism, the governance mechanism, can be easily manipulated by those who are party to the conflict. Fifth, it has been a total disrespect to the ASEAN leaders' decision and the UN. The State Administration Council has said that ASEAN and Myanmar should focus purely on humanitarian assistance. What about the other 4 points of the consensus? They cannot be separated from one another. They should be done in tandem. If you only focus on aid, it clearly shows that you will use aid as the breathing space, as the veranda, as the waiting room for other points to be addressed. SAC has disrespected also the United Nations. As the UN Special Envoy, I learned last night, has been blocked from attending tomorrow's meeting, where she was originally on the agenda. Last point, look at the agenda and the list of invitees. The agenda has been widely distributed. Well, I got it from some sources, including the media. They have the agenda. And we know that there will be this open session and closed session. And somehow I understand then the invitees include technical agencies dealing with disaster management and health issues. That means, to me, a total disregard of the context, disrespect on the ASEAN mechanism, because political crisis that leads to human rights violation and humanitarian crisis, you cannot deal with this kind of complex crisis with only technical tools and perspective. Otherwise, there is a good chance that decisions will be instrumentalized, will be manipulated. The input of the meeting, invitees, agenda, participants are all controlled so that the output of the meeting can be controlled. Okay. Second question. I don't know how long, how many more minutes, but I would like to ask the
another
second
2 minutes.
Okay. Second question given to me, Pak Marzuki, is why ASEAN should move beyond the 5-point consensus. Point number 4 of the 5-point consensus says that ASEAN shall provide humanitarian assistance through the AHA Center. And there are 3 messages I want to convey here. First, there is something wrong about the sentence, as you said, particularly the last phrase. You cannot just unplug the disaster management mechanism and AHA Center from disaster context into conflict. Even in complex emergency, it is the international humanitarian law that prevails because it provides better protection to the civilians and the humanitarian aid worker. Second, the complexity of operation requires ASEAN to go beyond the AHA Center. It's not just humanitarian crisis, it's also political crisis with human rights and humanitarian consequences. The issue that we have to deal with include IDPs, refugees, protection, regional stability, political security, health. Any epidemiologists should be very worried now, transnational crime, economic prosperity. So we should not get fixated only getting the AHA Center to implement point number 4. The problem is not with the AHA Center, Pak Marzuki, the problem is with the decision taking the AHA Center, plugging the mechanism from the disaster management of ASEAN into conflict because there is no crisis mechanism in ASEAN. We cannot do it all. We just have to acknowledge the facts that the gravity and complexity of the issue are so complex that ASEAN cannot rely only on one sectoral body, agency under one sectoral body, under one pillar. Third, the severity of the situation is so grave. UN has been appealing for 826 million. So far, only 5% of the required funds has been received. 14.4 million of people in need, but it's been underestimated, as mentioned by our local partners. What has ASEAN has done so far? 8 million pledges with less than 1 million distributed, and even that is being controlled. It is so little compared to the overall needs. And that brings me what the UN Special Envoy Nulin Hazard has said in her statement. Prioritizing principal agreement with diverse local humanitarian networks to deliver aid to all communities in need, and humanitarian assistance delivered through a diverse range of channels. We cannot stop the traditional humanitarian actors to do what they have been doing. That is going through the junta to sign MOUs and get permission for aid distribution. But it is very important, as mentioned by Dr. Nulin, that we don't allow aid to be instrumentalized, that we don't use the military setups, that IHL and humanitarian principles are respected. Therefore, the humanitarian community should really seriously consider cross-border assistance for the reasons that have mentioned by the previous speakers. If it is so...
Adelina, could you wrap up in half a minute?
And ASEAN and neighboring countries can also be pragmatic about it, as shown by the Chinese Red Cross. There are economic benefits, human and health security reasons for supporting cross-border assistance. And if the principle of humanity is still so difficult to follow, at least we should be familiar with our own notion of ASEAN being a people-centered, and of our own ASEAN anthem and motto, caring ASEAN, sharing ASEAN, one community. Not only for the Myanmar people, this is also an existential threat for the region. I'll leave it at that, Pak Marzuki. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Adelina. And thank you for reminding us on the criteria of humanitarian assistance, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. And I think it was a good point on conflating national disaster with political conflict crisis. And therefore, I thought this amplified the skepticism of the previous speakers also. And she underlined, of course, that diplomatically, we shouldn't be too hopeful of the consultative meeting, but nevertheless, I think we need to be seeking for answers and how to address the challenges. And therefore, I turn now to our last speaker, not the least, Kun Kasit Piromia. You have the floor.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
please, go ahead.
First of all, thank you for the invitation. Second, my profound thanks to the three previous speakers. I do share their passion, determination, and vision, and hope that we will be able to work with all of them in order to push our cause on the humanitarian assistance forward. Speaking on behalf of APHR, which I'm on the executive board, we have been networking with all members of parliaments around the world to push them, to push their respective governments to deny the legitimacy of the junta, to render diplomatic recognition to the NUG, and to push the United Nations, especially the UN Secretary General, to become more proactive on the Myanmar theater. It's surprising that the UN Secretary General was in Kiev and Moscow a few days ago, and he talks a lot about the humanitarian intervention and the possible role for the UN, for the United Nations. But I think he should now turn back his attention to the Myanmar crisis. So in that sense, you know, I would like to urge all of us to speak with one voice for the United Nations through the UN Secretary General to come into this humanitarian undertaking, for the UN to be the core and to coordinate with the various donor countries and also the countries in the region, particularly China, India, and Thailand, which has the common border with Myanmar. I also do believe that the meeting in Phnom Penh tomorrow, the consultative meeting, will not bear any fruits and so on. It's a farce. It's a theoretical act. Somdet Hun Sen is not going to do anything much on behalf of the Myanmar people, but because he is concerned more about his personal relationship with the junta leaderships and so on. And that is very sad. And that is the reason why APHR has been urging the leadership of Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on as founder members of ASEAN, I think, to take the mantle and to take the leadership in helping to solve the Myanmar crisis, and especially the humanitarian one. So we have been urging the Malaysian and the Indonesians and so on, first, to decide among themselves that they should take the leadership. Second, to speak to the Thai government to open the border for humanitarian assistance cross-border and so on. I think without the major intervention and the shouldering of the responsibility by the major ASEAN country, things would not work. We cannot leave any more responsibility to Somdet Hun Sen because he is an autocrat by himself. It would be very difficult for him to speak to the other autocrat how to do humanitarian work and how to return democracy to Myanmar and so on. So the first thing that I think would like to reiterate, and so that is for all of us to keep on urging Malaysia and Indonesia to take the leadership in trying to help solve the Myanmar crisis, and especially on this emergency humanitarian assistance in particular. Second is for them on behalf of ASEAN to coordinate with the UN Secretary General and for the UN to come in because they have much experience in the, I think, humanitarian assistance in the conflict zone and so on. And AHA could be a partial assistance to the whole UN undertaking, but the UN should be, I think, the core agency to do this. And at the same time, I think we could urge the Thai government, besides opening up border, to set up a coordinating center both in Bangkok and at the Thai-Myanmar border, and to work hand in hand with the United Nations agencies and so on, so that all these cross-border facilitation can take place and humanitarian assistance can move to the needy Myanmar people, not only at the border, but I think inside the Myanmar proper as a whole. So this is what I would like to, I think, suggest, and I think this is what AP Cha will continue to do so. At the same time, in my other hat as a Thai citizen, my deepest apologies to all the Burmese friends, Myanmar friends, I think for the inaction of the Thai government for the past 12 months. It is unbecoming of a Thai government to ignore the plight of fellow, I think, world citizens, just across the border and so on. And they have been so far thinking about the feelings of the junta more than the feelings and I think the hardship of the Myanmar people. I am fully ashamed of what has been going on for the past 12 months. But I have been, I think, pushing the Thai government and trying to work together with the various Thai agencies, especially the Thailand National Human Rights Commission, and as well as members of parliaments, especially in the House of Representatives, for all of them, I think, to urge the Thai government to make a final decision to open border and to be the coordinator with the UN agency in the facilitation of humanitarian assistance cross-border into Myanmar. I will continue to do this and will try to work as much as possible, both with the Thai NGOs and international NGOs and so on. But there is a need for all of us, I think, to speak louder to all our governments, to our members of parliaments and so on, for them to turn the attention to the crisis in Myanmar, especially this humanitarian needs that is, I think, every day, if it's being slowed down or delayed, I think the death and the sickness will be on the increase in an unprecedented manner. And I think we could also together urge the UN Secretary General directly for him to pay attention to the Myanmar situation. I think many of us have been meeting with Ambassador Noreen Hazel, the UN special envoy, but I think she needs help. I think we have to offer our, I think, cooperation as much as possible so that she will be in a stronger position to push the military junta and to push the ASEAN leadership to act in a more humanitarian manner. So these are some of the few points that I would like to express myself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Khun Kasit. I think that sums up actually the sense of all the previous speakers, and in a way identifies the basic issues that we've been able to cover over the past 1 hour or so. There's much concern about scaling up cross-border delivery, independence going beyond AHA, and leadership of ASEAN, specifically mentioning the two countries and coordinating with the United Nations. But specifically, I think Khun Kasit addressed the issue of the political viability, if I may use that term, the political feasibility of focusing on cross-border deliveries. And that, of course, may require also the coordination and cooperation of the Thai government. Now, without further ado, I think we've been able to get all the key messages from the speakers. I will now invite at the end of the presentation, and of course, with the readiness of our speakers to address any questions that might be posed to them, to see what questions have come up in the meantime. so that apart from the questions that may have been directed to specific speakers, perhaps the other speakers might also want to just jump in and add to the question. Now, I have a question that's been posed. This is addressed to Adelina. The UN Special Envoy released a statement yesterday calling on the ASEAN leaders and donors to prioritize principled engagement with diverse local humanitarian networks to effectively deliver aid to all communities in need. What should be the role of the United Nations and the United Nations Special Envoy in ASEAN's plans for humanitarian assistance? Now, this is a question addressed to Adelina, but as I mentioned, perhaps other speakers might want also to add. Please, Adelina, this is a question posed to you. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Pak Marzuki, and perhaps you can also add on, Pak. And because I'm going to give only the humanitarian perspective, but what I know, we have never dealt with this kind of crisis of this magnitude before within this region. So it is very important that ASEAN and UN, as mentioned by Excellency Kun Kasit, join forces to exert global pressure together for the Myanmar junta to allow for principled humanitarian access. The way I see it, this will have to be done strongly and even stronger. And the role of not only the UN Special Envoy, but also the UN OCHA, the Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator, who will be speaking tomorrow. The Emergency Relief Coordinator, Martin Griffith, who has the decades of experience in terms of peace, reconciliation, and diplomacy. The role of the Secretary General of the UN himself, who used to be with the UNHCR, and many other UN agencies. We need actually, we need to work together with them, because we are also dealing with the refugee issue. The UN has its own refugee convention and refugee agency. ASEAN does not have that. So it is very important that we acknowledge, right, the gravity of the issue and have the big heart to work with the UN. We work with the UN closely for the Nargis. For the disaster, we have the ASEAN UN action plan. So why can't we actually work with the UN? So we need to work with the UN at the highest level and with the relevant UN agencies, not only the UN, also the Red Cross, in particular the ICRC, who is the descendant of Solverino, of Henry Dunant, and who have been advocating for humanitarian principles. So they perhaps can give some examples, right? And I also would like to work with the lawyers and legal experts. I recently read a letter outlining, basically giving a case for a Myanmar representation in the United Nations, and your colleague Chris Sidoti and Ibu Yuyun from ASEAN HR Indonesia signed that letter. Perhaps we need to do the same, you know, and really make a case about the violation of humanitarian laws, not only that, of human rights, of international humanitarian law, and the ASEAN Charter, and get this signed by the best legal expert out there. It requires everybody's concerted effort with ASEAN and the UN and the humanitarian partners at the front, together with the neighboring countries. And Thailand plays a key role. I hope more and more Kun Kasit in Thailand. I really seek Thailand's support in this, because if Thailand agrees on this strategy, other neighboring countries will follow.
Can I come in?
Thank you. Thank you. Please, Kunkasit, yes. Please respond.
I think the UN Secretary General can write or call the Prime Minister of Thailand right away and asking the Thai side to open the border. It's nothing new for the Thai government, for the Thai society. We have been receiving refugees for the past, I think, 80 years since the French Indochina War and so on. I think that's all history, but we have been an open country, welcoming refugees of all types, and we were able to solve the problems together with the UN agencies. I was a senior member of the Thai diplomatic corps before I became foreign minister. And one of my work throughout, I think, 40 years of my diplomatic career was in constant touch with the UN agencies in Bangkok and delegations coming from the outside to work together to solve the border crisis pertaining to the refugees. So it's not something new. Second, for the record, the previous UN Secretary General, His Excellency Ban Ki-moon, did set up a Friends of Burma group at the UN headquarters in New York. And every time that I went to the UN for various meetings and sessions and so on, I did have a chance to attend this Friends of Burma group, which was working very hard at that time for the release of Daw Aung San Suu Kyi and for the return of Burma to democracy. So in that sense, why not now with the Myanmar crisis, the UN Secretary General can take the initiative and urge, I think, the Thai government in particular, and also to the oldest and founding members of ASEAN to work together in a more unison and proactive manner to help solve the Myanmar crisis. That can be done. There is this political will and a political decision to do so. And I don't think that the Thai government can sit on the fence and doing nothing and thinking about their cordial relationship with the Myanmar counterpart. They have to be concerned more about the plight of the Myanmar people and I think the wishes of the international community. But there is a need for that political push from the UN Secretary General. And I think in a week's time, there will be the US ASEAN Summit. We at APHR have sent a note urging the US government and the ASEAN leaders to pay attention to the Myanmar crisis also. So we are doing everything that we can to keep on urging ASEAN leaderships, dialogue partners, and so on, for them to come around and pay attention to the Myanmar crisis, which is worse than the Ukraine situation, because that is the killing between the Russians and the Ukrainians. But in Myanmar, it's about a junta. The Myanmar people, the Burmese themselves killing their own very people. That is atrocious. Thank you.
Thank you, Kunkasit. Would the other two speakers, Tutu or Salai, want to respond? We have a few other questions to address, and I think there's still time for you to intervene. In the meantime, I see no hand at the moment. I understand that a member of the Malaysian Ministry of Foreign Affairs is also in attendance, and could we have the honor to have the Malaysian MOFA representatives to say a few words, please. You have the floor, Excellency.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Can you hear me?
Yes, certainly. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you to all the previous speakers. It's quite insightful and interesting to hear the presentation from people outside the government system. On behalf of the Malaysian side, I just want to share views rather than to comment or to ask questions, but feel free to engage me. Basically, to touch on the 5-point consensus, I can say that ASEAN remains committed to the 5PC as agreed by the ASEAN leaders meeting last year. We do view the special envoy of the ASEAN chair on Myanmar as vital in fully implementing the 5PC, and also to ensure continuation of the decision made by ASEAN in addressing the situation in Myanmar. Hence, we remain supportive of the work carried out by the special envoy to this end. However, despite the effort and hard work by the first special envoy from Brunei, which is Dato' Erwan, and the current special envoy from Cambodia, His Excellency Prak Sakhon, progress on the full implementation of the 5PC remains stagnant. On this note, I believe some ASEAN member states, including Malaysia, are disappointed in the lack of progress, in particular due to the reluctance by the State Administration Council to allow engagement with all parties concerned, including the NUG and also the NUCC. Moving forward, perhaps ASEAN may need to review the practice and also to consider appointing a special envoy among the foreign minister of the country chairing ASEAN, which is only for a period of 1 year, while recognizing the various responsibilities shouldered as a foreign minister, looking at their burden, the responsibilities they have, perhaps it's better for ASEAN to look for someone who can commit, and the term could be beyond 1 year for continuity purpose. The Foreign Minister of Malaysia, Dato' Sri Saifuddin, during a recent engagement with APHR, which Kun Kesit was present, has stated that Malaysia intends to propose for ASEAN to informally engage with the NUG and also the NUCC. This will be taken up at the ASEAN Foreign Ministers level when they meet at the earliest opportunity. Of course, the matter will need further deliberation among ASEAN foreign ministers, and Malaysia is confident that the matter will be given due attention and consideration in view of the latest development. So I actually agreed also with the previous speaker, Ms. Adalina, when she says that, you know, the 5-point consensus, it has to progress hand in hand, in tandem, rather than pick and choose certain elements to be implemented and which is not to be implemented. Okay. As for the proposed consultative meeting, the mechanism is aimed at complementing the 5PC, in particular on item 4. ASEAN, which stated that ASEAN shall provide humanitarian assistance through the AHA Center. I think, you know, recognizing the limitation and experience of AHA, as mentioned also by the previous speaker, that they are more of disaster management rather than conflict management. So the consultative meeting is envisioned to comprise basically 3 compositions. First foremost is the ASEAN Special Envoy, Secretary General of ASEAN, and also the AHA Center. Second is the task force from within Myanmar to assist with the humanitarian assistance. And finally, to partner with our external partners, be it UN agencies and other international organizations or NGOs who have experience in conflict zones or in Myanmar. This is to ensure that humanitarian assistance could be channeled effectively to all Myanmar people in need without any restrictions or discrimination. Okay, thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Excellency. Very good points, especially on the issue of relating to the national unity government in Myanmar. Now, I have 2 questions. One is directed to Salai, and this question comes from Salai of the FIDI Foundation. The other one is a question addressed to Naututu, but let's start with the first one. This is a question as follows. It is also directed to Adelina, of course. There was mention made about AHA cooperation in humanitarian aid with SAC regime that might be manipulated so that it will not benefit people in a dire situation or affected by the ongoing armed conflicts. My question is, what should the international community do to ensure aid operation is not controlled by the junta? So that is a question to Salai and to Adelina. Go ahead, Salai. I think you might want to take a first jab at this. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you. It's a really good question. I think given the history of aid distribution in the country under the military regime, whether it be the current regime or the previous ones, and the fact that people are fleeing from attacks by the SAC, it is unimaginable that a distribution is being controlled by the junta itself. The fact that people are fleeing away from them makes it unqualified to be the aid distributor. And I think the international community should be looking at all ways possible, including cross-border aid, to be able to reach those in the most need.
Thank you, Sarai. Adelina, would you want to add anything here?
Thank you. I agree with Sarai on the point he has made, and also to add on that the SAC, the State Administration Council, has proven over and over again that they are not the responsible steward of humanitarian aid, that they don't have any intent to help the people. So my proposal is quite controversial, but I've made this case, and it's not only me actually who have made this case, but also some others, and they have written extensively. And this is about not including the junta in the decision-making of ASEAN, not only at the foreign ministers level and the ASEAN summit, but in all strategic and political decision-making, including when it comes to deciding on how the distribution aid should be managed. I'm not sure whether this will be pursued, but take one step if it is too high order, that is to involve the other parties to the conflict in the discussion. And listen to both sides, not only one side, but both sides, and decide for yourself. I think the legal expert and the lawyers have made a case, right? Who is actually being the illegal here? Who is actually representing the voice of the people here? I think we need to be honest about it. So if we cannot suspend the participation of the junta from all decision making of ASEAN and activities until they are committed with the 5-point consensus, the very least for ASEAN is to listen to the other party to the conflict that represents the will of the people. And it is the people that have said we don't want it to be caused through the junta. So we need to respect that. We need to respect that, because the objective of the humanitarian assistance is to ask what the not only what the communities need, but how the assistance will be delivered, right? And they have already said very clearly many times, we don't want it to be caused through the junta. So are we listening to them? Suspend participation, Pak. Suspend. Controversial, but start with this. Thank you.
Thank you, Adelina. Well said. Now, the question addressed to now Tutu, if I can read it out, Tutu. Thank you for your statement. You said that there are many thousands of IDPs from Southeast Myanmar sheltering from the SAC's airstrikes on the Thai border, living in caves and forests in very difficult situations. What would they say about ASEAN's plan to deliver assistance through the SAC? That is the question. You have the floor, and perhaps others might want to jump in. Please do so.
Thank you, Masuki, for bringing up the questions. Like in my presentations, I clearly state that SSC cannot reach to the ethnic area, which is the oppressed and make this instability to, attack in enemies. How can they deliver humanitarian aid to that area? I mean, to the ethnic organizations that they are attacking now together with the PDF. So we don't believe that the humanitarian aid can reach to the people who are hiding in the jungle, in the cave, won't receive it. That's why in my presentation, I said that any humanitarian aid or international organizations, actors, humanitarian actors need to consider and think about the partner focal persons with the civil CSO and faith-based organizations who are working for many decades to respond to the needs of the people on the ground in this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Tutu. Any other interventions from the speakers?
Just one point.
Yes, please, Kun Kasit.
There is an ongoing cooperation between the NGOs on the Thai side with the NGO on the Karen side or the Kareni and so on. What is the obstacle is the green light from the Thai government. You know, if there were to be green light for this, then I think humanitarian assistance can go across the border. And I think our Kareni or the Chan or the Mon friends and so on, they know how to distribute the humanitarian assistance to their people and to the villagers and so on, without any need for the SAC intervention or knowledge and so on. The problem is on the Thai government side that so far they have not given the green light. And then at the same time they are still what you call standing firm with the pushback policy. So I think the culprit more or less is my government. We all have to urge them to act accordingly. And I think humanitarian assistance already have that natural inflow, outflow, and so on, not a problem. You know, the communities on both sides, the NGO on both sides can handle that. But I think they don't want to do this sort of secretively, clandestinely, and so on. They want to do this in the open. And I don't think that we will be met with obstacle or intervention from the SAC and so on. They are not in the position to operate fully all over Myanmar anyway, and definitely not on the Thai-Myanmar side.
Thank you. Thank you, Kun Kasit. Any other interventions? Otherwise, I think, of course, we are getting close to the end of our event, and I do have to mention that there are a lot of other questions coming in, but we may have to leave it at there. I would nevertheless like to take upon myself, in fact, to just bring up a final point before we end, and that is to also highlight the humanitarian assistance for the displaced Rohingya community in Rakhine, who have been in the camps for 10 years now, more, and have this highlighted to be addressed by ASEAN within their plans, and to make sure that if they're not adequately addressed, then it has to be adequately addressed to include all the ethnic groups in Myanmar. But mentioning this, I think, is in order, as the issue in the beginning was, of course, the atrocities that took place in 2017, committed by the very same junta who are still in power. Now, having said that, it just remains for me to thank all the speakers for a brilliant presentation highlighting the challenges ahead. I think we have a very full plate. The activists and the NGOs and the civil society have an agenda to implement, and therefore our next task would be, of course, to see what comes out of the consultative meeting. Adelina was completely not hopeful about the outcome, but in fact, more pointedly, I think Kun Kasit expressed that the whole consultative meeting was nothing but a farce, and that sums up the consultative meeting's outcome, I suppose. And nevertheless, I think we are now on track to also address in a manner that befits the humanitarian traditions of ASEAN, to see to it that humanitarian assistance is being delivered through the people, by the people. And the next big thing, I suppose, will be for all of us to seek the cooperation of the Thai government to open up the border crossing, to initiate the channeling of the humanitarian assistance, which not only needs to be coming from ASEAN, but also in coordination with the United Nations. Thank you for all your participation and your presentations. May I now give back the floor to the organizers. Thank you.
ครับ